Chris Eubank Jr. wins a 10-round unanimous decision over Marcus Morrison. It was his first fight in, the best part of 2 years? And even then, the Matt Korobov fight only lasted 2 rounds. Prior to that, he fought James DeGale several months earlier in 2019, February of that year to be precise. Now, I have been asked over the past few months on many occasions whether I think this pairing between Chris Eubank Jr. and his new trainer Roy Jones will work out well. And my response has always been, I don't know. The jury is still out. I need to see Eubank Jr. in the ring with Roy Jones Jr. in his corner to see what happens with regards to the development of his style, his skill set, and so on. So this Marcus Morrison fight was very intriguing to me because I wanted to see the fruits of their labor. And as far as I'm concerned, the way it looks at the moment, this has been a very good move for Chris Eubank Jr. I know there's a lot of people who apparently were not impressed by his performance here against Morrison. There are people saying he looked like a pound shop Roy Jones, a Primark Roy Jones, saying the performance was quite boring. He fought in bursts. He could have got Morrison out of there, but he decided not to, and so on. They're using all these things as criticisms. Eubank and his trainer Roy Jones made no secret of the fact that they wanted rounds and they wanted to basically practice or try and execute the moves that they've been working on in training camp in Pensacola, Florida for so many months. So that's what it was. And all the way through the fight, you could tell that's exactly what it was. He was testing out particular moves in a real fight situation to see if he could pull it off the way he's been pulling it off in training. So the first thing I want to point out, and I've been saying this for many years, is that Eubank Jr. struggles with long-range boxing in the middle of the ring or on the front foot. If you've got a pressure fighter who's coming at Eubank Jr. and he's backing up, his long-range boxing is actually pretty good when he's moving backwards. But when he has to box in the middle of the ring against a long-range boxer like a Billy Joe Saunders, like a George Groves, and so on, this is where he struggles. He struggles with range control. He struggles with his footwork. You know, when he's in the middle of the ring at long range, he tries to attack and he almost trips over his own feet. He starts falling in, even when he hasn't got the correct range. So let me show you a sequence. I'm not going to play the video, but I'm just going to show you a paused still image of this particular sequence in round 5 of the Marcus Morrison fight. Now, prior to linking up with Roy Jones, in this situation here, Eubank Jr. would just fall in. And he did fall in at points in this fight, but he didn't smother himself. He didn't smother his own work, to the extent that he normally would. He maintained just enough distance to be getting off clean, snappy, crisp shots, even on the inside. But in this particular sequence, he decided to pin Morrison on the ropes and maintain long range, maintain distance here. So he's got him at jabbing range and he's looking to set up power shots off the jab. But he's not smothering his work. When Morrison throws, Eubank takes a half step back and the punch sails short of the target, or he ducks down here to his right and the punch sails over his head. And he's using good footwork, making sure he knows exactly where his feet need to be in order to move back just the right amount to evade the oncoming counter. This is something you wouldn't see from Eubank Jr. before. This is an improvement, a technical improvement. On top of that, he tried to position himself to Morrison's left here. Okay, so he's not making himself an available target for the right hand He's just out of reach of Morrison's right hand because he keeps moving here to Morrison's left. And he's also slightly outside of the main vision of Morrison. He's slightly in his peripheral vision, you see? So this is a technical improvement that I liked, and he tried this several times in the fight to kind of slide off to the left of his opponent and maintain this distance. Now, in the middle of the ring, again, Eubank Jr. lacked the footwork previously to be able to engage in a boxing match against a long-range boxer, whereby he can swap jabs with you, he can swap right-hand counters with you, he can lead with left hooks, and all these kind of things. And so the comparisons to Roy Jones, calling him a Primarch Roy Jones, okay, that may be valid, but it's still an improvement on what he was doing before at long range. It definitely is. And the use of his left hook in this fight was very Roy Jones-esque, because Roy Jones would keep a left hand out, both arms extended a lot of the time, but certainly the left. And he would use his feet to move in and out of range. So his arm wouldn't move much. His arm is out there in this extended position. And he would use his feet to move in and out of range. And then he would turn this extended arm into a left hook. So the punch wouldn't travel very far a lot of the time with Roy Jones. That's why it would catch you off guard. Because you're watching up here and you're thinking, okay, if he's going to throw a left hook, it's going to need to come from down here or something, right? I'm going to need to see him wind it up. There'll be a tell on the shot. But he'd move his legs in such a way and then twist his hips, whereby he'd get tremendous power, even though the punch doesn't travel a long way from this extended arm. And obviously, when your arms are extended, perhaps not to this extent, but I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about if you've watched the fight. When your arms are extended, the punch doesn't have to travel as far. You see, if your hand is here and you're throwing the hook, you're looking to catch the guy with a lead hook, it's got to travel all this way. But if your arm's already partly extended, it's a much shorter distance to travel to hit the target. This is something Roy Jones used to do. And I always found as well, experimenting with these kind of things, because I was a huge Roy Jones Jr. fan. And by the way, I have to commend the commentary team on DAZN. And it's very rare for me to commend commentary teams, but they did a very good job with their observations in this fight in terms of what Eubank Jr. was doing, the improvements he made, and their knowledge of Roy Jones Jr. as a fighter, the things he used to do, and the way his style worked. Okay, so definitely have to commend DAZN on very good observations and decent knowledge of Roy Jones Jr., who one of my favorite fighters of all time. Most of you know this. But Roy Jones putting his arms out in front of him, this is something I experimented with when I was a teenager fighting as an amateur. And I found that as somebody with long arms comparative to my height, it would help with my balance if I put my arms out in front of me. You see, and it would also help to establish my range. The arms out in front, Lennox Lewis also used to do this, almost like an antenna. When my arms were closer to me, I found I struggled more to judge the distance. So the arms are out there almost like an antenna, and you get a better feel of how far away your opponent is, and so on. Please excuse the torrential rain happening in the background. It sounds like a monsoon. Hopefully I'll be able to take out the sound of it in processing. But yeah, there was clear Roy Jones DNA in Eubank Jr.'s style here, and I think it's a good thing. Definite improvements in footwork, definite improvements in range control, which is what we are talking about in this particular still image. Range control was very good. Eubank Jr. has always been quite good in the pocket at ducking underneath, anticipating what his opponent is going to do and then ducking underneath their shots. But now he's incorporating range control with that. The one area where Eubank Jr. still seemed to be lagging behind, and the old Eubank is still there. And look, the old Eubank wasn't all bad. He's always been very good at putting his hands together. Good combination puncher, very good hand speed and so on, good stamina. That was all still there. And as we know, he's got a good chin. But the one area Eubank Jr. has always been lacking is at throwing long right hands at range. The right hand is almost always delivered as a bent arm shot, and it was still the case here. I think there was maybe one right hand late in the fight when Morrison was coming at him or Morrison was edging towards him, and Eubank Jr. threw a very Roy Jones-esque lead right hand. And that did have a bit more extension on it. But for the most part, still bent arm shots. He was getting a lot more extension in his jab than he used to, staying side on. Again, in this sequence here, typically the old Eubank Jr. would square up, but he was maintaining a side on position so you can keep that distance, the range control, keeping himself in a good position to evade what Morrison was going to throw back at him. But as I say, the right hand, still bent arm. Now, several years ago, Eubank Jr. complained of suffering from tennis elbow. And I don't know if he still has some kind of long-term issue with that right arm, but that is one area of improvement I've always wanted to see from him. And the fact that he's improved in so many other areas under Roy Jones, in which is evidenced by this performance, but still isn't throwing the right hand long, suggests that maybe he does have some kind of issue there with that right elbow, chronic issue. I don't know, maybe somebody could ask him. But overall, I like what I saw. Definite improvements. I understand that it was essentially a sparring session under the lights. That's okay. You're working with a new trainer. You want to adjust to the things that he's been teaching you, try and implement them in a fight against an opponent who is spirited, is somewhat tough, but limited. I mean, I see no issue at all with what Eubank Jr. did here. What I will say is, even though he made improvements, and to me he looks better than he has been before, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be good enough to succeed at the elite level. I mean, if you have a C-level fighter and they make certain improvements and become a B-level fighter, they're still just a B-level fighter. They're not A-level. You see it? So will these improvements be enough of an improvement to succeed at elite level? Most people, based upon what I've seen, are going to say no. Okay, yeah, he's improved this and that, but it's still going to be quite a way short of what's needed to succeed among the top flight. Well, that remains to be seen. Perhaps that'll turn out to be the case. But I always like to see fighters make the most out of their ability, irrespective of how far it gets them. I just like to see them with the right trainer, with the right level of commitment, doing the right things to allow them to maximize their potential, to reach their potential. And under Roy Jones Jr., I think we may actually get that with Eubank. One of the things I have to imagine Roy Jones Jr. likes about Eubank is his athleticism. He can do things which perhaps a lot of other fighters that Roy Jones has trained can't do. You know, when he puts his hands together, very impressive hand speed and combination punching from Eubank Jr. has always had that. I'm sure Roy Jones likes that because, of course, he was tremendously fast himself and he would throw impossible combinations. Combinations you'd never seen any other boxer be able to throw. Roy Jones Jr. would do it in his prime. Okay, he was like Neo in the Matrix. So the fact he's got a student who isn't on that level of athleticism, but is certainly a lot more athletically gifted than probably most of the fighters he's worked with before, I'm sure Roy Jones likes that. Also, because of who Roy Jones is and what he's achieved in his career, Eubank Jr. clearly respects him far more so than other people he's worked with. And that includes Ronnie Davis and his own dad, Chris Sr. So, again, with fighters, they have to respect the trainer. It doesn't have to be a drill sergeant, type situation where the fighter is completely subservient to the trainer. It doesn't have to be that, but there has to be respect. The fighter has to believe that the trainer knows things that he doesn't know. That the fighter that the trainer is going to be able to analyze him, his attributes, and tell him the right things in order to get the most out of his ability. And that appears to be the case here with Eubank Jr. and Roy Jones. The way they communicate in the corner, there seems to be tremendous respect there from Eubank towards Roy Jones. And that's always good to see. When you respect your teacher and you believe in your teacher, you're far more likely to get results. So that's another positive here. So overall, I thought it was a good, what can we call it? Sparring session? Sparring session with little gloves and no headgear. I thought it was good. I saw lots of improvements there, particularly the range control was very good. You know, putting out, see, one of the differences I have to say with Eubank Jr., and again, there's a distinction here between reach and arm length. Just Google it, look it up for yourselves. Arm length and reach are not the same thing. Eubank Jr. is around the same height as Roy Jones, but he appears to have shorter arms. And therefore, the antenna, that's what I called him, where Roy Jones would stretch both arms out in front of him. That doesn't work quite as well with Eubank Jr., or perhaps anywhere near as well as it did with Roy Jones. But I still think it works to some degree. I still think he's better off doing that than not doing it. Okay? Not against every fighter, not in every situation, but certainly against fighters who tend to throw more straight shots rather than hooks. I think that could work quite well for him. And as I say, overall, the range control, the footwork, being more patient as well, not looking to go out there and rush in all the time, but actually boxing, thinking about what you're doing, being strategic, playing the mind game. So Eubank Jr. in the ring has never really been about playing the mind game that much. And what I mean by that is having your opponent confused, whereby he doesn't know when you're going to attack. He doesn't quite know what you're doing. He doesn't quite know whether you're taking a rest or whether you're trying to lure him in. You know, he's not sure. Eubank before, and this is another observation that the DAZN commentators made, he didn't really have many tricks up his sleeve in the ring, okay? He would go flying in at 100 miles an hour and it became quite predictable. And if you were good enough, you'd be able to evade his attacks. Whereas now, what I saw in this Marcus Morrison fight, it's a lot more nuanced. And he's trying to box, he's trying to play the game, he's trying to be a bit more of a chess player. And I think that is definitely a step in the right direction for him. He's still going to need the all-out attacking ability, which we know he has for some fights and in some situations. But in a lot of other situations, he's going to need to be more of a chess player. So the fact he's trying to develop that, I think is very good. So yeah, overall, I like what I saw. Ideally, you'd want to see a few more fights like this, really and truly, to just, get used to fighting in a new style with a new mindset and so on. But according to Eubank Jr., he's ready for the likes of Golovkin and Charlo and all these people right now. Interestingly, Roy Jones in an interview said that he would like to see Eubank Jr. fight Kell Brook next, if he can't get the Golovkin fight next, okay? Now, to me, that is indicative of Roy Jones not being quite as keen to step Eubank Jr. up to the elite level as Eubank Jr. is himself. To me, that's indicative of Roy Jones maybe wanting to pump the brakes a little bit, spend more time developing Eubank Jr., imparting all the knowledge he has and continuing to improve. I just get the impression Roy Jones feels like he can have a finished article with Eubank Jr., whether that's good enough to succeed at elite level remains to be seen. But I do feel like Roy Jones seems to be implying that Eubank Jr. is still a work in progress. And he's not the finished article that Roy Jones envisions in his head for this particular fighter. I'm sure he knows that he's not going to be able to reach the level that he was at in terms of ability, but who can, right? But I'm sure he, in his head, after spending a lot of time with Eubank in Pensacola, believes there is a certain level he can reach with Eubank's ability. And he's not quite there yet in terms of boxing IQ, in terms of technique, and so on. So, yeah, for me, it was a very interesting watch. And the Kell Brook fight, I mean, Roy Jones likes that. Eubank kind of shrugs his shoulders and smirks when they mention Kell Brook. We'll see if that can happen. Golovkin, I was watching Golovkin's most recent bout again on DAZN. And, looking at that guy, I don't think Eubank Jr. would be completely out of his depth, to be honest with you. I think that based upon what I saw there and based upon what I saw in the Derevenchenko fight, Golovkin is not quite what he used to be. Look, against the Polish guy, it looked like typical Golovkin, but that's because there wasn't much coming back at him. Whereas against Derevenchenko, that didn't look like typical Golovkin. That looked like a Golovkin who's seen better days. And one of the things that Derevenchenko did, which Golovkin found so difficult to contend with, is he was coming in very low underneath Golovkin's shots. See, Golovkin's a very straight up guy. He doesn't bend at the waist much. We know he's not that quick. And Derevenchenko coming in very low, changing his height, coming in at different angles. This was a nightmare for Golovkin. He found it difficult to track the opponent and understand where he was going and what he was doing. Eubank Jr. can do a lot of that too. He isn't Derevenchenko. He's a taller guy. Perhaps he's a bigger target. But, he's certainly in the past hasn't been as technically good as Derevenchenko. But with the improvements I've seen in this fight here against Marcus Morrison that he's made under Roy Jones Jr., and the ability we know he already has, the combination punching ability, sturdy chin, and something I've talked about previously where he's able to duck underneath shots in the pocket. I mean, go back and look. I know it's only Avni Yildirim, right? Not a great fighter. But if you look at the sequence where Eubank Jr. stops Avni Yildirim, from what I can remember, both guys are swinging it out. Eubank Jr., during that exchange, is ducking underneath Yildirim's hooks and then punching in between them. He's always been good at that. And when you've got a guy like Golovkin who doesn't swing, right? Golovkin throws short shots. So timing beats speed. You need to be careful that you don't get cracked and leveled when you're exchanging with somebody like Golovkin. But because he is much slower than Eubank Jr. in terms of hand speed, if Eubank positions himself in the right way, like he did against Marcus Morrison, I can see him getting shots off and having success against Golovkin and at least giving him some trouble. One of the things I noticed as well, especially later on in the bout, is Eubank Jr. throwing mid-range / long-range combinations that were very short punches. A lot of the time, particularly at long range, Eubank Jr. has a tendency to wing shots, wide shots, when he doesn't have the opponent right in front of him. When he's at mid-range or long range, he'll be winging wide shots. Whereas these shots, very Roy Jones Jr.-esque. Short, I think it was something like a left uppercut, right hand, left hook combination, something like that. And they were very short, snappy shots. He kind of threw at mid / long range, where he wasn't smothering himself. He was maintaining good range. So again, those kind of shots against a guy like Golovkin, if he can move off to the side, get a combination like that off and move around, I don't think he'd be totally out of his depth. I have to be honest. I do think that even if he lost to Golovkin, Golovkin would know that he'd been in a fight based upon what I'm seeing. So yeah, that's my take on it. The last point I want to make, in fact, let me get another video open here for you guys. Okay, so this is some footage of Eubank Jr. hitting a punch shield. This is my own footage. And this is something I noticed, which is definitely not a good thing. And I hope Roy Jones Jr. has addressed this. And in fact, if Eubank Jr. has been doing this in fights, and I think he actually has, I think I've seen him in the past do this in fights, then it may explain why his punches are not quite as concussive as they perhaps could be. Now, his dad has spoken about the fact that Eubank Jr. wears winning fight gloves, and winning fight gloves tend to be more forgiving on the opponent than maybe rivals, grants, and so on. And he said that's why Eubank Jr. hasn't had the kind of one-punch knockouts that he was getting, because Eubank Sr. used to wear, well, he wore many different glove brands, but certainly Cleto Reyes. Well, based upon what I'm seeing here and what I've seen in a few Eubank Jr. fights in the past, that's only part of the story, because the other part of the story, which I think is far more crucial, is the fact that here, when Eubank Jr. is rattling off these uppercuts on this punch shield, he's doing so with an open hand. Now, when you watch the footage in real time, you might not catch it because his hands are moving so fast. Let me just mute it here for a second. Right, look. So he's rattling it off. You don't realize that he's actually punching with an open hand. Look, let me slow it down, try and find the frame for you. Okay, not that one. There you go. Look at this. His palm is open. This is the fingertips here. This is supposed to be down here. It's supposed to be punching with a closed fist. He's not. When he's rattling off these fast punches, he's not closing his fists. He's punching with an open hand. And of course, that means you cannot transfer the power that you're generating through your hips, through your legs, and so on. There's the open hand again, right? You cannot generate, your hand can stay open, but it needs to, there we go again. Look at this, an open hand when he's connecting with his punch shield. What's that all about? You can keep your hand open, but you need to clench your fist at the moment of impact in order to transfer the power. Otherwise, the power is going to dissipate. Okay? There again, look at this. A left uppercut, he's throwing it with an open palm. What's that all about? So I really hope this is something that Roy Jones has addressed from Eubank Jr. because I swear I have seen him do this. I've caught certain slow-mo video replays where again he's throwing these uppercuts and these shots with an open palm. It's a very bad habit. You know, you want to be. Some guys find it difficult to get this kind of fast hand speed and throw these fast shots when their fists are clenched. They find it easier to keep their hands open. They can move their hands more quickly. You need to train yourself to be able to throw the punches just as fast, but with the fists clenched. For whatever reason, I don't know the physiological reason, but try it for yourselves. You might find it's easier to throw the punches, these kind of fast uppercuts, when your hands are in an open or semi-open position, not fully clenched fists. You got to train yourself to be able to do that with fully clenched fists. Okay. You've also got to train yourself when it comes to power transfer at the moment of impact or just before the moment of impact to make sure your fist is tightly clenched. Yeah. This is something, these are some of the subtle things that top level punchers do. The Mike Tysons, the Tommy Hearns, where your hands loose, but when you throw the shot out, split second before impact, tightly clenched fist, bam, you're going to have the maximum impact, maximum power transfer. And these little details make a big difference. Some people might know, oh, it can't make that much of a difference, Hatman. Trust me, it makes a big difference. So hopefully Roy Jones Jr. is addressing that. Hopefully he's picked up on it and he's addressing it. I have to imagine he probably has. And if he has, and we can get Eubank Jr. clenching his fist properly, then maybe we're going to see an increase in the punching power too. I have to say, he didn't really look like he was punching with particularly great power against Marcus Morrison. I do have to say that. His power looked a lot better against someone like Avni Yildirim. I know Yildirim, again, is not a great fighter, but he appeared to be sitting down on his shots more against Yildirim. The fact that this was just basically a sparring session for Eubank Jr. You know, I can overlook to some degree the fact that he didn't appear to be punching with tremendous power here. And not that he's ever had tremendous power anyway, but he's got respectable power. But perhaps we're going to see more of that in terms of proper sitting down on the shots, punching with, you know, full leverage and so on. Perhaps we'll see that in subsequent fights. But yeah. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below about Eubank Jr.'s performance against Marcus Morrison. When I was in my Discord server, shout out to the Hatman and the Gang Discord. I got 2 different Discord servers. I got Discord server for people who just sign up for my boxing content on Patreon. Then I've got my other Discord server called Hatman and the Gang, which is a much bigger server with far more people. It's got different rooms basically in that server where we talk about different things. And one of them is a boxing room. And when I was asking people if they knew of a link for me to watch this Eubank Jr. Morrison fight, because I didn't watch it live, the response was, you're not missing anything. You don't really need to watch it. People didn't seem impressed. I'm glad I didn't take their advice and I did end up finding a copy of the fight to watch, because I was actually very interested in this performance, studying the improvements, particularly because I've always been a huge admirer of Roy Jones Jr. as a boxer. He was one of my favorite fighters of all time, still is. And from an entertainment perspective, I've always liked the Eubanks. Now, Eubank Jr. may not have succeeded at the highest level, but he's certainly been entertaining in the vast majority of his fights. Perhaps this Morrison fight was one of his least entertaining performances in the eyes of most, but you look at many of his other fights over the years, it's been entertaining. You know, he lets his hands go. He's brave. He has a go. He doesn't fight scared normally. So I've always liked that about him. And you combine that, the athleticism he has, with the entertainment factor, with one of my favorite fighters of all time and one of the greatest fighters of all time in Roy Jones, it was intriguing to me. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide range of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&A sessions, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got a Discord server where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. There's no contract, no commitment, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.